Welcome back. In Lecture 1, we set the stage for our study of the basic principles of economic reasoning. We tried to put a little more urgency into the importance of economics by recognizing that because of institutional differences, societies in some times and places have done a better job of addressing the problem of scarcity than have societies in other times and places. And I hope you found that proposition, that institutions matter, to be a hopeful one, a suggestion that change and improvement are possible. Not easy, to be sure, but definitely possible. Before the end of this lecture, we'll look at how institutional change has improved the lives of many millions of the poor just since the beginning of the 21st century. But for now, we need to delve a little deeper into the dynamics of scarcity. The problem scarcity creates for us is that it forces us to make choices. It may be hard to really believe scarcity exists when viewed from the relative comfort of developed, wealthy nations, but even our most complacent students can recognize that in the midst of abundance, they still have to make choices. And that's the answer to the question, how do we know when we've encountered scarcity? We know when we have to make a choice. Economic reasoning proposition number 1 captures the implications of scarcity for the individual, and it reminds us, as we think of rich and poor nations, of the connections between the choices of individuals and the relative well-being of societies and nations. People choose. That's a really important point. Governments don't choose, societies don't choose, businesses don't choose, people do. But what this economic reasoning proposition is telling us is that there's a connection between social outcomes, things like whether nations are rich or poor, and the choices that individual people make. We suggested in the first lecture that institutions create the framework within which people confront scarcity and make those individual choices. The institutional framework shapes incentives. In other words, it sets out the system of punishments and rewards, which in turn affect people's perceptions of the costs and benefits of the alternatives they face. So, within that system of incentives, what happens when people make choices? The economist's answer is, there ain't no free lunch. Or economic reasoning principle number 2 states it a little more formally. Choices impose costs. People receive benefits and incur costs when they make decisions. The choice of a cost is the value of the next best alternative foregone. And note that that's measurable in time or money, or oftentimes in just some alternative opportunity or activity that's been given up. Important point, all, not some, all choices impose costs. The economic term is actually opportunity cost, and it's a good practice to use the exact term, especially at the beginning of a course when students tend to confuse cost and price. The definition of opportunity cost is the foregone alternative, the next best alternative that was given up in making a choice. Sad but true, because of scarcity, there's always a cost. Yes, there are benefits, but every decision also carries an opportunity cost. Suppose someone holds out 2 small plates, one with a gingerbread cookie and the other with chocolate chip cookies, both of which you love. And the person says to you, you can have one. And you choose the plate with the chocolate chip cookies. The opportunity cost you bear is the opportunity to have the gingerbread man. He's the foregone alternative that you gave up in order to have the chocolate chip cookies. He's your next best choice. Think of it as saying, if you hadn't chosen the chocolate chip cookies, what would you have chosen? It's important here to use the term opportunity cost precisely, especially when you have more than 2 alternatives, because opportunity cost isn't all the other alternatives you faced, just the next best one. So the process in your mind, and it may not be a conscious one, is that you prioritize all your alternative opportunities. Then you narrow down the list some more, and finally, you choose the best one. The next best one on the list, that's your opportunity cost. not all the others that you considered and rejected, just the next best one. Say you find $20 in the pocket of a pair of jeans you haven't worn for months. Think of all the things you could do with it. I'm sure you can come up with plenty of options for $20. As you sort through the possibilities, you seriously consider taking a day off work to play golf. But in the end, you choose to take an old friend to lunch. Since the golf game is what you would have done, not just one of the many things you could have done, it's the opportunity cost of taking your friend to lunch. Now, notice that unless putting the $20 bill back in the jeans pocket and keeping it there for another 6 months was your next best option, $20 is not your opportunity cost. $20 may very well be the price of the lunch with your friend or a round of golf, but it's not your next best alternative since you didn't intend to keep the $20 anyway. This also brings us back to the fact that scarcity exists even in the face of abundance. Look at the list on the screen. Some resource is limited in every situation, forcing us to make choices. Now, true, there are some people who don't seem to have limits at an all-you-can-eat buffet. I think they're called teenagers. But sooner or later, limited time and or stomach size does catch up with them. Which brings us to another important point about choice and opportunity cost. Economists contend that people's choices are always rational. Yeah, I know. You're protesting that they don't know your mother. But hang on a minute. Just as scarcity doesn't mean rare in econ speak, rational doesn't mean making the right choice or the choice that any sane person like you or me would make in that situation. Rational in economics means choosing the alternative that's perceived to have the greatest excess of benefits over cost. The perceived part is crucial here. When you look at other people's decisions, because of course you already know that your decisions are perfectly rational, you have to take into account the other person's perceptions, the information available, his circumstances, his experiences and values, etc. So, why is this a valuable insight? Because if all choices are rational, it must be true that the decider anticipates the benefits will outweigh the costs. If we look at someone else's choices of alternatives and don't see it in the same way, the challenge for us is not to just dismiss the choices as irrational, but to figure out how the decision maker perceives the opportunity cost of that choice. The process of understanding other people's choices is called opportunity cost analysis. And here are the steps. First, ask yourself, what are the considered alternatives? Remember, the decision makers may be different from yours. Next, prioritize the alternatives. What's the best and what's the next or next best? What does the decision maker perceive to be the benefits of each alternative, the one chosen and the next best one? That next best one, the one he would have done, is the opportunity cost. You can see this process with a simple exercise, and simple is a good place to start. Opportunity cost, although relatively simple, is still a pretty abstract concept. I mean, we're saying that when you make a choice, the cost is giving up something you didn't have in the first place. Okay, that's out there a little bit, especially since we know that many of our students haven't really developed to the stage where they're comfortable with abstract thinking. So let's put it in personal terms. What was the first decision you made this morning? The very first choice you had to make upon waking up? Right, whether to get up. So here's a schematic for an opportunity cost analysis of that decision. First, who's the decision maker? Yep, that would be you. Next, what are the top two considered alternatives? The nice thing about this example is that it's relatively easy to identify the top two alternatives. Get up now or don't get up now. Now note that don't get up now doesn't mean never getting up. It might just mean that you have to face the same decision again in 10 minutes when the snooze alarm goes off. An interesting thing about these alternatives is that they can both look pretty good, and that tends to be true of lots of our choices. It's not clear-cut that the best alternative is good and the next best is bad. Life isn't usually, anyway, a game show where you get to either walk 50 miles in the snow barefoot or take a limo ride. Most of the time, there are lots of good alternatives, or in the case of a grumpy teenager, lots of crummy ones. The next thing to consider is the benefits of those top two alternatives. So, what do you perceive to be the benefits of getting up as soon as the alarm goes off? Jot them down. Okay, my list would be things like being first in the shower, being a little bit early to work, not having to rush, having time for breakfast, stopping at the coffee shop. Your list is probably different, but in any case, I'm certain you can think of at least one benefit. Now, what about the other alternative? The big benefit is obvious, right? More sleep. In the winter, I'd add staying warm. Can't think of a whole lot else, and it's not a long list. But that's okay. The point is that there are benefits to this alternative too. So, we've laid out the benefits, and it's decision time. What do? We could go with a longer list, but that's not necessary. It turns out that it depends on how we value the benefits we've identified. Now, personally, I hate to rush or to be late. So for me, the benefits of getting up now are huge, and that's the alternative I'd choose. What's my opportunity cost? Well, what was the next best alternative I gave up? I gave up the opportunity to not get up now, and I refused the benefits of more sleep and staying warmer that went with that opportunity. Was this a rational choice? Well, yeah, it was for me, because I, not you, perceived that the benefits of getting up now far outweighed the benefits of not getting up now. But what if I'm a grumpy, sleep-deprived teenager? Or what if it's Saturday morning? Or what if I don't feel good? Or what if it's freezing out and the furnace hasn't come on? Or what if I'm just not a morning person? In that case, I might choose to not get up now and willingly bear the opportunity cost, that is, giving up the benefits of not rushing or stopping at the coffee shop. My choice would still be rational. Now, one caution here. Suppose that I choose to not get up now and hit the snooze alarm several times until the furnace comes on and the house is warm. In my rush to get to school, I drive too fast and I get a speeding ticket. The speeding ticket is not the opportunity cost of my choice to not get up now. It's a consequence, and that's a very key distinction. In teaching about cost, don't be sloppy with the terminology. When I gave up the opportunity to get up now, I refused the benefit of not having to rush. This time, the consequence of bearing that opportunity cost, or refusing the benefit of not having to rush, was a speeding ticket. But it wasn't the opportunity cost. Consequences are still important, and they affect my perception of benefits, however. Next time I have to consider whether or not to get up now, that speeding ticket might make me place more value on the benefit of not having to rush. Opportunity costs adhere to all decisions, whether it's an individual's choice about when to get up, or choices made in families or businesses, or larger decisions by communities. Even choices made in government have opportunity costs. Here's a policy decision that's been debated for so long, we can probably use it as an example for the next several decades. Should we, or should we not, open the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, to oil drilling? Again, for simplicity's sake, let's suppose that the top two alternatives are simply drill or not drill. Go through the same steps as for the get up decision. First, though, remember what we said about decision makers. They're people. In this case, they may be government people, but they're still individuals making choices. So for the decision maker part of the grid, enter the name of your congressman or one of your senators. With some research, you could fill in the benefits of each alternative as perceived by your congressperson, which, by the way, makes an excellent student exercise. But for our purposes, let's generalize. The benefit of drilling in ANWR is more domestic oil and less dependence on foreign oil. The benefit of not drilling is leaving it as wilderness. The decision and the willingness to bear the accompanying opportunity cost depends on how those benefits are valued, and that depends on whose name you've listed as the decision maker. It's a pretty safe bet that Alaska's congressman values those benefits differently than one representing a House district with an active environmentalist population. Resources are limited for government too. Now, I know sometimes we wonder if the people in government realize that, but they are. Decisions made in local government often clearly illustrate the constraints of scarcity because there the budgeting process tends to be less, shall we say, flexible than it is at the federal level. If your city is like mine, it cannot by law operate with a deficit. So spending more of the available tax revenue on one thing means spending less on something else. For example, what's the opportunity cost of using local tax revenue to hire more policemen in a city with growing crime rate? Think about your own city. What are the growing demands on the budget? Role play a member of a city council voting on the budget for the upcoming year. Particularly if council positions are elected, here are some of the questions that ought to be going through your mind. What other programs could be eliminated or reduced? Who bears that opportunity cost of hiring or not hiring more policemen? Who's likely to be willing to bear that cost? In other words, for whom are the benefits likely to exceed the cost, and who's likely to be unhappy about bearing that cost? Or for whom are the benefits of the foregone alternative likely to be greater than the benefits of hiring more police? This scenario also helps us focus on a key characteristics of cost. First, costs are the results of actions. They don't just exist out there somewhere. They happen when people make choices. In our example, when someone votes on how to use the city's tax revenue. Second, costs are to people. Things have no cost. In everyday conversation, we talk about the costs of things. How much did that sweater cost? Or that hamburger costs $1. But what we're really talking about is the price, a kind of shorthand for the opportunity cost we bear if we had spent the money in another way. And it may occur to you that although we often talk of costs in monetary terms, many costs aren't monetary. In an earlier example, if you'd played golf rather than having lunch with your friend, you'd be out $20 in either case, but that doesn't tell us much about the cost to your friendship. Remembering that costs are to people also helps us remember that costs are subjective, which helps us to understand why, when faced with the same alternatives, like hiring policemen or putting new stoplights in front of the elementary schools, people will make different choices. So it's people who have costs and bear the burdens of the foregone alternatives. People give up some benefits in order to have others. Sometimes people's choices impose burdens on other people. For example, in our city council scenario, if the city managers decide to hire more policemen, the burden may be disproportionately borne by the family living in a low-crime neighborhood where a proposed new stoplight was slashed from the budget. If, on the other hand, new policemen aren't hired, the burden of the cost falls on people living in high-crime neighborhoods. And depending on where they live and whether they have children, the city managers may not feel the cost except at the ballot box next fall. Third, all costs lie in the future, and therefore we can only anticipate them. They don't occur until the action has been taken and the choice has been made. Thus, there's always an element of uncertainty when it comes to cost, and the more uncertainty, the more difficult the choice. I mean, if you knew for absolute certain that every time you slept in you'd get a speeding ticket, how often do you think you'd give up the opportunity to get up now? No kidding, huh? The failure to understand that costs lie in the future leads people into what's known as the sunk cost fallacy. It's an easy one to fall into. Even if you teach economics, then you should know better. Suppose you pay $10 to go to a movie, and within about 2 minutes you realize that it's a stupid, offensive movie, and you wonder if the film critic actually saw it before writing the review. After half an hour, it's clear to you that it's a real dud and not likely to get any better. Okay, it's decision time. 2 alternatives: stay or get up and leave. If you decide to stay because you already paid $10 for the ticket, you've fallen into the sunk cost trap. Because that $10 that you already spent is the point. You already bore the cost. You already spent the $10 on the ticket and a half hour of your time. You can't get them back. The future costs and benefits should be driving your decision at this point. What could you do in the next hour and a half if you leave the movie? That's the relevant question. We see recognition of the sunk cost fallacy in some of our cultural tradition. Have you ever heard the admonition that throwing good money after bad it's kind of like throwing money away? Or the saying that it's no use crying over spilled milk? Both of those are warning us against the sunk cost fallacy. A good example of this fallacy for high school students involves the dilemma of the car repair. Suppose you buy a used car, and over a couple of months you have to spend $3,000 on major repairs. A month after that, it breaks down again, and this time the estimate's another $1,000. If you decide to go ahead with the repair because you already spent $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 or any amount of money, you could very well be throwing good money after bad, and you're definitely committing the sunk cost fallacy. The relevant costs are the future costs, remember? So instead of saying, but I already put so much money into it, you should be asking yourself, are the benefits of paying for the next repairs likely to outweigh the costs? In other words, what else could I do with that $1,000? What other alternatives do I have? What about selling the car and putting a down payment on a newer one? The last but not least implication of recognizing that costs occur in the future is that all the costs and benefits that affect decisions are marginal costs and benefits. Marginal means next or additional, and in decision making it contrasts with all or nothing. Economics recognizes that we almost never make all or nothing decisions. We make choices at the margin. That is, we don't choose between buying a car now or never buying a car. Instead, we choose between buying a car now versus waiting 6 months, or buying a used car versus buying a new one, or buying the new one with the upholstery upgrade versus the cloth seats, or leasing the car versus buying it, getting the extended warranty or not, etc., 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 etc. These are marginal choices. Similarly, the teenage kid at the all-you-can-eat buffet, he's not deciding whether to have no pizza or every pizza on the shelf. He's deciding whether to have a first piece, and then a second, and then a third, and a fourth, and so on. The other thing about margins is that they're different for different people, and they can change with the situation. For example, look at the people standing side by side in the picture on the screen. What's the marginal cost of the next step? While we don't know the margin for each of them, we do know that it matters which direction they're facing, and we know that if they're facing different directions, they're also facing different margins. When we get to markets in later lessons, we'll look more closely at the dynamics of the margin, especially as it relates to price. But for now, let's just recognize that if we don't think marginally, we're going to have a hard time getting all the benefits available from our alternatives. For the individual, then, economics teaches us that as long as the marginal benefit of an activity exceeds the marginal cost, we're better off doing more of it or continuing with it. The dud movie? Marginal thinking means asking yourself, okay, I've put in a half hour. Are the benefits of sitting here another half hour, even another minute, worth it? Now, if your date likes the movie, they may be. If you're by yourself and already making a mental list of all the other things you could be getting done, then the answer is probably no. Okay, then for the economy as a whole, as we'll see shortly, marginal decision making is also one of the keys to increasing incomes and economic growth. Now that we have a good understanding of scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost, we need to connect it back to the question of why some nations are rich and others are poor. The connection comes through the institutions a society uses to deal with scarcity. Because of scarcity, every society has to answer three basic questions about resource uses. What, as in what goods and services are we going to produce with our limited resources? How, that is, how are we going to produce it? How will we use those resources in the best way? And who gets it? Or how are we going to distribute these things once they've been produced? In shorthand, we can say that every economy has some sort of institutional arrangements for rationing scarce resources, goods, and services. Rationing. Again, we've got a word that has a little different meaning in economics than in everyday conversation. We tend to think that rationing only occurs in dire circumstances, like in World War II when people got rationing coupons for gasoline or meat or tires. We use the term in a way that seems to imply that if we were careful to avoid dire circumstances, we wouldn't have to ration. Not true. Like scarcity, in fact, because of scarcity, rationing isn't optional. The pertinent question isn't, should we ration? It's, how should we ration? There are lots of ways to ration, and it turns out that the method we adopt determines the way we answer those three basic economic questions, and it affects economic growth and the creation of wealth. Now, you can explore the alternative methods of rationing by bringing two of something into class. 2 DVDs, 2 cans of cold soda on a hot day, t-shirts, a couple of free hamburger coupons, anything that many students are likely to value. Ask who wants them, and when more than 2 people raise their hands, presto, you have an illustration of scarcity and the necessity of rationing. Simply ask how you're going to decide who gets the 2 DVDs, and jot down the responses on the board. When you group the similarities, you're likely to get something like this list. 2 things should become clear as you go through the list. First, we can come up with a list like this because we can think of something that is rationed by every method that's up here. And second, we ration most things by price. So go through the list and challenge students to come up with real-world examples for all the non-price methods. Then divide them into groups and have the groups create skits showing what might happen if everything were to be rationed by one of the non-price methods on the list. Remind them that the goal of rationing is to reduce the impact of scarcity and that their skit should indicate how well their chosen method achieves that goal. This exercise provides the background for a discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of the various methods, and in particular, of price rationing. Students should emerge with a better understanding of the benefits of living in an economy that rations, that is, that answers the 3 basic economic questions by price. First, with price, the outcome is clear, as opposed to, say, rationing on the basis of need or merit. Somebody's got to decide who's the most needy or who has the greatest merit, and there will be disagreements. Second, with prices, individuals can affect the outcome based on their desire for the good or service. And that's clearly not the case for something like a lottery or voting or methods that depend on somebody else deciding or setting up the criteria. And finally, price rationing provides incentives, that is, rewards, for consumers and producers to reduce the impact of scarcity. In upcoming lessons, we'll examine in great detail 2 additional advantages to rationing by price, or, if we want to put it in institutional terms, 2 additional advantages of adopting the institution of markets to address scarcity. Price rationing directs resources to their most highly valued uses. And finally, individuals' power and freedom of choice is enhanced. And that's a significant advantage. Price rationing works so well to address scarcity because it turns out that prices are very powerful incentives, and institutions that incorporate price incentives produce predictable outcomes. We know that people react to changes in prices in very predictable ways, in their roles as consumers and in their roles as producers. And the reason they do so is that when prices change, opportunity costs change. Price changes cause us to reconsider that little grid in our heads where we compare the benefits of our alternatives. And when we do that, our behavior changes in ways that help to reduce scarcity. We'll look at the mechanics of markets and rationing by price in the next lesson. But before we end this one, let's connect our exploration of choice and opportunity cost to our attempt to find insight into why some countries are rich and others are poor. In the first lecture, we argued that certain key institutions matter, that nations with open markets tend to be wealthier, for example. What we're saying, in effect, is that choosing institutions that ration by price is associated with economic good. Evidence? Well, there's a great deal of evidence, and more is piling up all the time. But here's one piece. It's kind of negative, but it's compelling nonetheless. As Hugo Chavez has moved the Venezuelan economy away from open markets and rationing by price towards centralized command, someone else decides type of rationing, both the freedom and wealth of the Venezuelan people has fallen, despite the great value of their natural oil resources and their educated and talented population. On the positive side, and as an illustration of the power of the margin, look what has happened as China has moved toward more price rationing by opening their markets. Do these graphs make clear to you that we're talking about hundreds of millions of people moving up out of abject poverty just in the last decade? And this hasn't been an all or nothing change. China hasn't completely abandoned the command economy or suddenly become non-communist. The changes, the opening of markets, the granting of some limited property rights, have been at the margin, and marginal change has made a difference. Now, poverty in China hasn't disappeared by any stretch of the imagination, but it has definitely been reduced, which is something we can't say for the impoverished nations where institutional change seems unlikely. This ends the lecture for Lesson 2. In the next lesson, we'll focus on the mechanics of markets, looking at the model of supply, demand, and how prices allocate resources, goods, and services in the economy.